Marcus Reed had built the company with his own hands, and on a gray Tuesday morning in October, the woman he loved most in the world raised her hand in a boardroom to strip it from him. He didn't shout, he didn't beg. He simply reached into his jacket pocket, touched a single folded document he'd carried for 3 years, and understood that everything was about to change. What his wife didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the vote they'd just taken was worth nothing at all. Before we go any further, if you believe that patience and integrity will always outlast arrogance, do me a favor and hit that like button and tell me in the comments where you're watching from today. Subscribe, because this story of quiet strength and poetic justice is one you'll want to see through to the very end. Now, let me tell you exactly how a man learned that the people closest to you can also be the ones most blind to who you truly are. 12 years earlier, Marcus Reed had started Meridian Structural Design in the spare bedroom of a rented apartment with $11,000 in savings and a reputation for never missing a deadline. He was an architect by training, a builder by temperament, and a man who measured his worth not by what he displayed, but by what he could quietly deliver. He hired his first employee within a year. He landed his first major municipal contract within 3. By the time he turned 41, Meridian occupied 2 floors of a glass tower downtown, employed 68 people, and posted revenue north of $40 million a year. Marcus owned it all. Every brick of it, every contract, every reputation-defining project bore the fingerprints of his patience. He met Diana at a fundraising gala when the company was 5 years old and beginning to hum. She was elegant, articulate, and ambitious in a way that felt, at the time, like a match for his quiet drive. She had a background in corporate finance and an instinct for boardrooms that he lacked. When they married 2 years later, it felt natural to bring her into the business. He gave her a title, an office, and eventually a seat on the board. He believed in the honest way that decent men believe, that sharing the summit with the person you love makes the climb worthwhile. What Marcus didn't fully register in the busy years that followed was how Diana's ambition slowly curdled into something colder. She began to speak of the company as though its success were an inevitability rather than a thing he had bled for. She surrounded herself with allies, junior executives whom she cultivated with lunches and favors and small promotions. She grew close to Nathan Vance, the chief operating officer, a smooth and impatient man who had joined 3 years earlier and who believed, quietly and consistently, that Marcus was too cautious, too old-fashioned, too slow for the modern world of aggressive growth. The signs were there. If Marcus had cared to look for treachery in his own home, Diana began questioning his decisions in front of the staff. She held meetings he wasn't invited to. She spoke of restructuring, of modernization, of the need for fresh leadership. And Marcus, being a man who trusted the people he loved, told himself it was healthy debate. He told himself that a marriage and a business could both survive disagreement. He was wrong on one count, and he would learn precisely how wrong over the course of a single autumn. The catalyst arrived in the form of a woman named Elena Foster, Marcus's assistant of 9 years, a sharp and loyal presence who saw far more than she was ever thanked for. One evening in September, Elena stayed late to finish a filing and overheard, through the thin wall of the executive suite, a conversation she was never meant to hear. Diana and Nathan were speaking in low, confident voices about a vote, about the board, about the number of shares each director controlled, and how, if they aligned the right signatures, they could remove Marcus as chief executive and install Nathan in his place. Diana laughed at one point, a soft and dismissive laugh, and said something Elena would repeat to Marcus word for word. She said, "He built the ladder. That doesn't mean he gets to stand on top of it forever." Elena did not sleep that night. The next morning, she requested 10 minutes of Marcus's time and closed the door behind her. She told him everything. She expected shock, denial, perhaps anger. Instead, Marcus listened with the stillness of a man absorbing weather he had long forecast. He thanked her. He asked her not to speak of it to anyone. And then he sat alone in his office for a long time, looking out at the city he had helped to shape, and made a decision that had nothing to do with rage and everything to do with truth. Because here is what Diana had forgotten, or perhaps never truly understood. 3 years earlier, during a period of aggressive expansion, Meridian had needed capital. Diana and Nathan had pushed hard for outside investment, for selling equity to bring in growth funds. Marcus had agreed to a restructuring on paper, one that created a formal board and issued shares to a handful of directors and investors. It looked, on the surface, like the kind of dilution that eventually loosens a founder's grip. Diana had watched it happen and quietly counted the seats, believing that the arithmetic was tilting in her favor. What she had never bothered to examine closely, because she assumed she already understood it, was the shareholders' agreement that governed the entire structure. Marcus had drafted that agreement with a lawyer he trusted more than he trusted almost anyone. Buried within its careful clauses was a provision that Marcus, as founder, retained a class of shares carrying supermajority voting rights on any matter concerning the removal of the chief executive. On ordinary business, all shares voted equally, but on that one question, the question of who led the company he had built, Marcus's voice counted for more than all the others combined. He had insisted on it, not out of paranoia, but out of a builder's instinct that the man who lays the foundation should not be evicted from the house by tenants. He had signed it, filed it, and then, in the trusting years of his marriage, forgotten to mention its full weight to anyone. The document had been sitting in a folder for 3 years, waiting. The vote was scheduled for the second Tuesday of October. Marcus knew the date. Elena knew he knew. And in the 2 weeks before it, Marcus did something that would have surprised anyone who thought they understood him. He did nothing. He attended his meetings. He signed his contracts. He came home each evening to a wife who smiled at him across the dinner table while planning his professional execution. And he smiled back, not out of deceit, but because he had decided that the confrontation would happen on the right ground, at the right hour, in front of the right people. He would not accuse Diana in their kitchen. He would let the truth reveal itself where it mattered most. He spent those 2 weeks quietly reviewing the shareholders' agreement, confirming with his lawyer that every provision remained valid and enforceable, that no amendment had ever weakened his position. It hadn't. Diana, for all her financial background, had never requested a full copy of the founding documents because she had assumed her seat on the board and her marriage to the founder made her position unassailable. She had underestimated him for years, and that underestimation was about to become the most expensive mistake of her life. The morning of the vote arrived cold and clear. Marcus dressed carefully, choosing the same charcoal suit he'd worn the day he'd signed Meridian's first municipal contract. Diana was already gone when he came downstairs. She'd left early. She'd texted to prepare for the board meeting. He read the message twice, poured himself a single cup of coffee, and stood at the window watching the light climb the buildings across the street. Then he drove to the office he had built, past the reception desk where his own name was etched into glass, and up to the 14th floor where 7 people were about to decide his fate without realizing they had no power to do so. The boardroom was full when he entered. Diana sat at the far end, poised and cool in a navy suit, her hands folded on a leather portfolio. Nathan Vance sat to her right, already wearing the faint satisfaction of a man who believes the game is won. Around the table sat the other directors, 2 outside investors, a longtime finance officer named Priya Anand, an operations director named Carl, and an independent board member named James Whitcomb. 7 directors in all, Marcus included. Elena stood near the door with a tablet in her hands, her expression carefully neutral, though Marcus caught the flicker of loyalty in her eyes as he passed. "Marcus," Diana said, her voice warm and terrible, "thank you for joining us. Please, sit. He sat. He set no papers on the table, made no notes, said nothing beyond a quiet, "Good morning." And Diana, mistaking his calm for ignorance, began. She spoke for 11 minutes. She spoke of the company's need for renewed energy, for aggressive expansion into markets Marcus had been too cautious to pursue. She spoke, with a surgeon's precision, of his reluctance to take risks, of opportunities lost, of a leadership style better suited to the company Meridian had been than the company it needed to become. She never raised her voice. She never once looked at him with anything resembling cruelty. That, perhaps, was the most difficult part for Marcus to bear, the sheer casualness of it, the way she dismantled 12 years of his life as though reading a weather report. Nathan spoke next, echoing her, offering himself as the natural successor, a leader with the vision to double revenue within 3 years. The outside investors nodded. Carl studied the table. Priyananand said nothing, her jaw tight. James Whitcomb watched Marcus carefully, as though sensing something in the room that the others had missed. "So," Diana said at last, turning to face her husband directly, "we're calling a vote. A motion to remove Marcus Reed as Chief Executive Officer of Meridian Structural Design, effective immediately, and to appoint Nathan Vance in his place. Marcus, you're welcome to speak before we proceed." The room went still. Every face turned to him, and Marcus Reed, the man they had already buried, looked around the table with the patience of someone who had waited 12 years to be underestimated one final time. "I'll speak," he said quietly, "but not to defend myself. I don't need to. I'd rather listen to the vote. Please, go ahead." Diana's eyes narrowed just slightly. This was not the reaction she had prepared for. She had expected pleading or fury or a desperate appeal to their marriage. Instead, her husband sat with his hands loosely folded, watching her with something that looked almost like sadness. She recovered quickly. "Very well," she said. All those in favor of the motion to remove Marcus Reed as CEO." Diana's hand rose. Nathan's rose. The two outside investors, after a moment's hesitation, raised theirs. Carl, avoiding Marcus's eyes, lifted his hand halfway. 4 in favor, then a hesitation, then a definitive count. Priya Anand kept her hand down, James Whitcomb kept his down, and Marcus never moved his. But it didn't matter, or so Diana believed. 5 votes out of 7. A clear majority. "The motion passes," Diana announced, and there it was, the faint tremor of triumph in her voice. "Marcus, I'm sorry, truly, but the company needs this. Nathan will assume your responsibilities immediately. We'll arrange for a transition of your Elena," Marcus said. The single word cut across the room. Diana stopped. Every head turned toward the assistant standing by the door. "Yes, Mr. Reed," Elena answered. Marcus reached into his jacket, to the inner pocket where the folded document had lived for 3 years, and set it gently on the table. He smoothed it flat with 2 fingers. Then he looked up, and for the first time that morning, he let them see the full measure of the man they had misjudged. "Call the shareholders," he said, "the real ones, and bring in the founding agreement from the corporate file. I think everyone in this room needs to understand what they've just voted on." Diana's expression flickered. "Marcus, we have the founding documents. The vote is legitimate." "There's nothing. There is one document," Marcus said, his voice never rising above conversational, "that you never asked to see. In all these years, Diana, in all your careful planning, you never once requested a full copy of the shareholders' agreement I signed when we brought in outside capital. You assumed you knew what it contained. You assumed a board seat and a marriage made you my equal in this company, but you never read the founder's clause." The room had gone utterly silent. Priya Anand leaned forward. James Whitcomb's mouth twitched into something that might have been the beginning of a smile. "There's a provision," Marcus continued, sliding the document toward the center of the table, "governing exactly one matter, and one matter only. The removal of the chief executive officer. On every other question, my shares vote equally with yours. But on this question, the question of who leads the company, I built with $11,000 and 12 years of my life, my founder's shares carry supermajority voting rights. 60% of the total voting power reserved to me alone for this single decision. Nathan Vance had gone pale. That's not possible. The restructuring diluted my economic stake, Marcus said. It never touched my control over this one question. I insisted on that clause the day we signed. My lawyer drafted it. It was filed with the state, disclosed in the corporate records, and it has never been amended. You could have read it any time in the past 3 years. None of you did. He turned the document so the others could see the highlighted section, the signatures, the corporate seal. James Whitcomb reached for it and read slowly, then set it down with a low exhale. He's right, Whitcomb said. I've seen this clause. I signed off on the filing myself. Founders supermajority on CEO removal. It's ironclad. Diana stared at the paper as though it might rearrange itself into something bearable. That can't be enforceable, she said, but the certainty had drained from her voice. It's entirely enforceable, Marcus said gently, which means the vote you just took, the vote you spent weeks orchestrating in secret, the vote you smiled at me across our dinner table while planning, has no legal effect whatsoever. To remove me as CEO, you would need 60% of the voting power. My founder's shares alone exceed that threshold, and I vote against my own removal. The motion fails. The room seemed to tilt. Nathan Vance sank back into his chair. The two outside investors exchanged a glance of dawning horror, the look of men who have just realized they backed the wrong horse and can no longer unplace the bet. Carl put his face in his hands. And Diana, for the first time in the 12 years Marcus had known her, had absolutely nothing to say. Marcus let the silence stretch. He was not enjoying this. That was the thing Diana would never understand about him, then or later. He took no pleasure in her defeat, but he had reached a place beyond pleasure, a place of simple, unshakable clarity about who he was and what he would no longer tolerate. I want to be clear about something, he said at last, addressing the entire table. I didn't come here today to punish anyone. I came here to learn the truth, and now I have. Diana, Nathan, you spent weeks building a case to remove me, and I'll grant you this. You were thorough, but you built it on a foundation you never bothered to inspect. That's the difference between us. I inspect the foundation before I build. It's why this company exists. It's why it has survived every downturn while your bolder competitors collapsed. He paused, gathering himself, and when he continued, his voice carried a weight that filled the room. Let me tell you what the past 2 weeks have been like. 2 weeks ago, my assistant came to me and told me that my wife and my chief operating officer were planning to vote me out of my own company. Do you know what I felt? Not anger, grief. Because I realized that the woman I married had never actually seen me. She saw a ladder. She said as much. He built the ladder. That doesn't mean he gets to stand on top of it forever. Those were your words, Diana. My assistant heard them through the wall. Diana's face crumpled, not with remorse, but with the horror of exposure. Elena stood by the door, unflinching, meeting no one's eyes but ready to confirm every syllable. So, for 2 weeks, Marcus went on, I said nothing. I came home to you every night. I let you believe I had no idea. And I want you to understand why. It wasn't strategy, not really. It was because I needed to know if you would stop. If at any point in those 2 weeks you would look at me across our own table and change your mind, remember that we were partners. Remember that I gave you a seat at this table when you had nothing. You never did. You went through with it. And now you know the cost of assuming that a quiet man is a weak one. He gathered the document, folded it once more along its worn creases, and returned it to his pocket. Then he addressed the board, with the calm authority of a man who had never actually lost control of the room. Here is what happens now. The vote is void. I remain Chief Executive Officer. Nathan Vance, your employment with this company is terminated, effective immediately, for orchestrating a coup against the leadership of the firm. You'll be escorted from the building within the hour. To the outside investors who supported this motion, I understand you were persuaded by people you trusted. I'll offer you a fair path to sell your shares back to the company at market value, and we'll part ways cleanly. Carl, you have a choice to make about whether you want a future here. We'll talk privately. Priya, James, thank you for keeping your hands down. I won't forget it. Nathan opened his mouth, thought better of it, and closed it again. Within 20 minutes, security had arrived, and the man who had walked into that room, certain he'd leave it as chief executive, walked out of it with a cardboard box and no reference. The outside investors filed out shortly after, murmuring apologies that Marcus received without warmth or cruelty, only a nod. Carl lingered, ashamed, and asked for a chance to make it right. Marcus told him to think about what he actually wanted, and Carl left with the beginnings of that reckoning on his face. And then, it was only Marcus and Diana in the empty boardroom, the autumn light slanting across the long table where their marriage had just been laid bare more completely than any divorce filing ever could. You planned this, Diana said finally, her voice thin. You knew, and you let me walk into it. I knew, Marcus agreed, but I didn't plan your humiliation, Diana. I planned my survival. There's a difference, though I don't expect you to see it. You walked into this room to destroy me. I walked in to defend the thing I built. The fact that you couldn't tell the difference is exactly why we're here. She stood, gathering her portfolio with shaking hands. So, what now? You'll divorce me. You'll ruin me. I won't ruin you, Marcus said, and he meant it. That's never been who I am, and I won't let you turn me into something smaller than I am. But you'll resign from this company today, and you'll resign from this marriage, because a person who plots against you in secret has already made both decisions. I'm just acknowledging what you've already chosen. Diana left without another word. The door closed softly behind her, and Marcus Reed stood alone in the boardroom of the company he had built, 12 years of his life, vindicated in a single quiet morning. He did not feel triumphant. He felt instead the clean ache of a wound finally allowed to heal in open air. The weeks that followed were not easy, but they were honest, which was more than Marcus had had in years. The divorce proceeded with a dignity that surprised even his lawyers. Marcus insisted on a fair settlement, refusing every suggestion to punish Diana financially. I didn't marry her to hurt her, he told his attorney, and I won't leave her to hurt her either. She'll have what's fair. Nothing I built alone, but everything we truly shared. Diana, faced with a man who would not stoop to her level, found that his fairness stung worse than any vengeance could have. Nathan Vance discovered that a reputation for staging boardroom cucks follows a man wherever he goes. No serious firm would touch him. The two outside investors sold their shares back and quietly exited, and Marcus used the reclaimed equity to establish an employee ownership program, giving the 68 people who had stayed loyal a genuine stake in the company they helped run. Priya Anand became his chief financial officer. James Whitcomb stayed on the board, and Carl, after 2 weeks of genuine reflection, came to Marcus's office, admitted his cowardice honestly, and asked to earn back his place. Marcus, who believed that redemption required real change rather than mere apology, gave him the chance. Carl never wavered again, but the person Marcus thought about most in the quiet weeks of rebuilding was Elena Foster. She had risked everything to warn him, expecting no reward and asking for none. So, on a bright morning in November, Marcus called her into his office and offered her the newly created role of chief of staff, a real seat, real authority, a salary that reflected 9 years of loyalty he had too long taken for granted. Elena wept, and then she laughed, and then she accepted. Loyalty, Marcus had learned, is rarer than talent and more valuable than either wealth or ambition. And when you find it, you honor it. There is a lesson in all of this, and I think you already feel it. The people who underestimate you are not usually your enemies from the start. Sometimes they are the ones who share your table, your bed, your name. They mistake your patience for weakness and your quiet for ignorance, but real strength has never needed to announce itself. It builds, it waits, it inspects the foundation while others admire the height of the tower. And when the moment comes, it does not shout or beg or take pleasure in another's fall. It simply stands, unmovable, on ground it laid itself. Marcus Reed didn't win because he was cruel. He won because he was prepared, because he was principled, and because he understood a truth his wife never grasped, that you cannot vote a man out of something he carries inside himself. The company was never really the building, or the shares, or the title. It was his integrity, his patience, his refusal to become someone he wasn't. And that no board on earth has the power to take away. So let me ask you this, and I truly want to know. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who thought they knew exactly who you were? Have you ever held your peace, knowing the truth would speak louder than any argument? Tell me your story in the comments below. I read every single one, and I promise you, someone out there needs to hear that they're not alone. If this story moved you, if you believe that patience and integrity will always outlast arrogance in the end, hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss a story of quiet strength and hard-earned justice. And remember, the next time someone mistakes your silence for weakness, let them. They're only telling you how little they understand about what you're truly capable of. Until next time, take care of yourself, keep your foundation strong, and never let anyone convince you that the quiet ones aren't the strongest people in the room.